Let's talk about something you use every single day, something that shapes our world, our dreams, our whole lives. But here's the thing. It's all built on a story, a collective fantasy we all agree to believe in. Yep, we're talking about money.
To get things started, I want you to just look at this number. $315 trillion. That's the total amount of global debt at the beginning of 2024. Now I know, that number is so huge it's almost meaningless, right? So let's try to put that into some perspective.
If you take everything the entire world produces in a year, every car, every coffee, every bit of software, that's about $105 trillion. So what that means is that humanity as a whole owes itself 3 times more money than the entire planet can possibly create in a year.
Hold on a second. How does that even work? How could we possibly owe more money than actually exist? It feels like a total paradox. And to untangle it, we have to go back to basics and ask a much bigger question. What even is money really? You see, the answer isn't gold, it's not paper, it's not even numbers on a computer screen. At its absolute core, money is just an idea. It's a powerful story that we all agree to believe in. Just look at this. On the left, you've got a clay tablet from Mesopotamia, 3,500 years old. It's basically an IOU for some barley. On the right, you've got modern crypto, a promise secured by complex code. The technology could not be more different, but the fundamental promise? It's exactly the same. It's a contract based entirely on trust. In fact, this whole idea is baked right into the language we use. The word credit comes directly from the Latin word credo, which means I believe. That's not an accident. All money, every single dollar, is a form of credit. It only has value because we all believe it does.
Okay, so if money is just belief, how does that lead to a world with $315 trillion of debt? Well, this is where it gets really interesting. This is the trick that shows how money is actually created, seemingly out of nothing. It works through something called fractional reserve banking. Let me walk you through it. So you deposit, say, $10,000 in a bank. You still have a claim to that $10,000. You can spend it whenever you want. But the bank doesn't just let it sit there. They loan out $9,000 of it to me. Now all of a sudden, you have $10,000 and I have $9,000. Poof! Your original $10,000 just became $19,000 in the economy. The key here is that banks don't just lend money. They literally create it when they make a loan. And this leads us to a really wild conclusion. The real source of most of the money in the world isn't a government printing press, and it's definitely not a gold mine. It's us. It's the promises that regular people and businesses, debtors, make to work and pay it back in the future.
So, who came up with this system? How did this wild idea of creating money from promises become the engine for the entire global economy? Well, it wasn't by accident. It was built piece by piece. It really all comes down to 3 huge innovations that popped up back in the 1600s. First, you had banks that started lending out way more money than they actually had in their vaults. Then, someone invented the joint stock company, which let total strangers pool their money to fund massive projects. And finally, the stock exchange was created, which made these shares of belief easy to buy and sell. These 3 things, working together, basically created the blueprint for modern capitalism.
So let's fast forward to today. What has that engine produced? Well, it's been unbelievably successful at creating wealth, but it's also concentrated that wealth in a way that is just staggering. Just take a look at this chart. That huge top slice, that's nearly half of all the wealth on the entire planet, and it's all controlled by less than 1% of the population. Just let that sink in. A group of people you could fit into a medium-sized country owns almost as much as the other 8 billion of us combined.
And of course, there's the other side of the coin, that little sliver at the bottom. That represents more than half of every person on Earth, over 4 billion people who have less than $10,000 to their name. And that's not just cash, that's everything they own, period.
So what does this actually look like in real life? Well, let's take a city like Moscow. For someone earning an average salary to buy an average apartment, they would have to work for nearly 12 years. And that's if they saved every single ruble. No food, no clothes, no taxes, nothing. Which is why, for most people, the only way to own a home is to take on decades of debt and become another part of that $315 trillion number we started with.
So, if this is the game we're all playing, whether we like it or not, how do you actually get ahead? It all starts with understanding one very simple but incredibly powerful difference.
On one side, you've got liabilities. These are things that actively take money out of your pocket, like your car payment or credit card debt. But on the other side, you've got assets. And these are things that put money into your pocket, often without you even having to lift a finger, like stocks that pay you dividends or a rental property that brings in cash every month. This really boils down to that classic saying, the poor work for money, while the rich make money work for them. And that's not just some nice-sounding quote. It is the fundamental difference in strategy between those at the bottom of the pyramid and those at the top.
Michael Jordan is the perfect example. His talent, his work ethic on the court, that made him a millionaire, for sure. But it was his assets that made him a billionaire. His deal with Nike pays him royalties every single year. That's an asset. He bought a basketball team and later sold it for more than 10 times the price. That's an asset. His labor had a limit, but the growth of his assets, basically unlimited.
And that brings us to the final and most important question, the question we all need to ask ourselves. When you look at your own life, what are you collecting? Are you piling up liabilities that drain your wallet? Or are you building assets that work for you, day and night, even while you sleep? Because ultimately, the answer to that question is probably going to decide where you end up on that pyramid.